Calls in the subway.
Hello. Please keep this anonymous. The truth is that from the story I will tell, you will understand that I don't want to give out my personal information. I lead a life like anyone else, working late and taking one of the last subways to get home. That night, like every other night, I waited at the subway station, lost in thought. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket, an electric shudder that snapped me out of my reverie. I didn't recognize the number on the screen. Assuming it was a wrong call, I answered casually. "Hello, who is this?" I asked, hearing only the echo of my own voice on the line. There was no answer. Before I could hang up, the call was cut off. The next day, the routine was repeated. The same wait, the same night subway, and most importantly, the same call. There was no answer, just the hum of the dead line. I felt a twinge of unease, but dismissed it as a strange coincidence. My days at work were long and routine, and my nights were occupied by the solitude and silence of my apartment. But every night, at the subway station, the phone would vibrate again. As the days passed, curiosity turned to trepidation. I found myself waiting for the call, anticipating it, with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. In my mind, I began to form images of who the mysterious caller might be. Perhaps a bored stranger. Perhaps an enthusiastic prankster. Or maybe something darker, more unknown. Despite my fantasies, the reality of the calls remained ominously ordinary. No voice, no message, just the constant buzzing of the dead line. But the routine of these calls, their relentless predictability, began to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. There was something unsettling about this wordless insistence, this silence full of presence. However, despite the growing sense of bewilderment, I did nothing to change my routine. I kept taking the night subway, kept answering the calls. Because after all, they were just calls from an unknown number. What harm could they do? But even as I tried to convince myself of this, a little voice in my head murmured with increasing insistence, "Something is not right." And every time the phone vibrated, I felt that voice get a little louder. The routine of calls continued, unchanging, like a clock with its constant ticking. But with each call, my unease became a larger shadow, an echo echoing in my mind. Still, I clung to the comfort of my routine, to the cold comfort of familiarity. It was a night, like any other, in the deserted subway station when the routine was broken. The phone vibrated in my pocket, the unknown number glowing on the screen as usual. I answered, expecting the usual silence. But this time, there was no silence. On the other end of the line, I heard a voice, a soft, almost inaudible voice, like a whisper fading in the wind. I didn't understand what it said at first, the words slipping from my consciousness like water through my fingers. But then, with growing horror, I began to understand. The voice whispered details of my life, trivial, unimportant things that only I would know. The color of the curtains in my living room, the name of my boss, the taste of the coffee I drank every morning, harmless, useless facts, but which, nevertheless, should not be in the mouth of a stranger. I did not recognize the voice. It only sounded like a young man's, and then he hung up. I felt as if the world was vanishing around me. I staggered against the wall of the subway station, the phone pressed against my ear as if it were my only link to reality. But reality was changing, twisting in incomprehensible ways. The next few nights were a blur. The calls continued, the voice kept whispering. Now it revealed more personal, more intimate details. Memories of my childhood, secrets I had never shared, thoughts I had barely formulated in my own mind. Paranoia took over. I looked over my shoulder constantly, saw shadows lurking around every corner. Every glance from others seemed suspicious, every conversation a threat. My life, once full of routine and solitude, had become a nightmare. I tried changing my phone number, I even tried to stop taking the subway, but nothing worked. The voice always found me. Its whispers always filled my ear. And with every word, with every revelation, I felt as if a piece of my sanity vanished, replaced by a growing, paralyzing fear. One day, the calls stopped. There was no vibration in my pocket, no whispering voice on the other end of the line. Silence, which had once been a source of bewilderment, was now all that remained. But the relief I had imagined did not come. Instead, I felt a pang of dread, a primal fear that grew with every beat of my heart. For if the calls had stopped, what would come next? Every night I found myself waiting for the call, longing for the sound of that voice I now associated with the deepest terror. Every vibration of my phone made me jump. Every call from an unknown number made me shiver. But I never heard the voice again. My life became a shadow of its former self. I could no longer concentrate at work. I could no longer enjoy the solitude of my apartment. Every noise startled me. Every shadow filled me with fear. Paranoia had taken over, turning every moment into torture. I don't know what became of the voice. I don't know what it wanted. I may never know. All I know is that the calls have left an echo in my life, and though the calls have stopped, the fear remains, a constant reminder of what once was. To be honest with you, I have my suspicions about who it might be. I have people who hate me at work, and I wouldn't be surprised if they would do all this just to annoy me. However, the fact that he gives so many personal details makes me ponder the matter. How did this person know so much about me? Anyway, I just hope he doesn't call me back.
The invisible.
Hello, Herr. I hope my story can be in a video of yours. I was a traveling salesman in the subway. I was 16 years old at the time. This experience occurred on a day that was nothing special. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I sat down to devour the cake I had just acquired from a stall at the station. Hunger had bitten my stomach hard enough to make me forget the dubious provenance of the food. I chewed slowly, not to enjoy the food, but to try to prolong this little break in my routine. In this subterranean realm, people moved like specters, their pale faces and listless expressions painting a picture of tedious ordinariness. I watched their figures fading into the corner of the tunnel and wondered if I looked as faded as they did in this environment. Vendors like me were an integral part of this subway landscape, moving among passers-by like fish in a river of people. I had been part of this flow for so long that I could almost guess people's fates and stories from their posture, their pace, their eyes. But that afternoon, as I bit into my cake, I noticed something was different. My usual resting place was a lonely corridor in the station, a corner away from the crowd that allowed me to observe without being observed. Despite its unkempt appearance, this corridor had provided refuge for many a break, but that day as I bit into the stale bread of my cake, I felt the familiarity of the place fade away, leaving me with an uneasy feeling. I looked around, trying to find the source of my unease. The mosaics on the wall had faded with age, the floor tiles were worn, and the dim lighting barely alleviated the oppressive darkness of the tunnel. But none of this was new. It had been there forever. So, what had changed? Why did I feel that something strange and desolate had taken over my old corner in the subway? I sat there, eating, watching the scene unfold in the subway hallway. But instead of the typical images of the daily routine, I found myself observing something I could neither understand nor explain. It was nothing more than a sensation, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a cold current that made me shiver. But it was there, as real as the flickering lights and the bitter taste of my food. My thoughts were interrupted by a noise, something unusual. A man stumbled at a specific point in the corridor. That in itself was not strange. Tripping is common in the subway. But it was what happened next that really puzzled me. The man, after regaining his balance, stood there for a while. He examined the place where he had stumbled. His eyes searched for something on the ground. Maybe he was looking for that something he had stumbled on. But there was nothing. He shook his head, confused, and then continued on his way. I thought maybe he was tired or distracted, but the event repeated itself. A woman, young and elegant, passed by the same place. She stumbled, and then she stood still, looking down, searching for an explanation on the worn subway floor. Her face was a poem of bewilderment. After a while, she continued on her way, but the confusion was still evident on her face. I watched this from my place on the floor, the cake still in my hands. The stumbling continued, one after another, always in the same spot. Each person passing that spot seemed to fall into the same invisible trap. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. It was as if an invisible force was playing with them. As time went on, curiosity became a knot of uneasiness in my stomach. I looked at the spot in question. There was nothing there, not a loose stone, not a broken tile. Just the same smooth, worn surface as the subway. What was causing all this? I decided to move closer, to leave my place in the corner, to examine that mysterious spot closely. But I stopped. An old fear came over me, a kind of instinctive wariness that told me to stay away. I stayed there, sitting in my corner, watching as one after another, people kept stumbling into the same spot. I finished my cake and stood there, staring at the spot in the subway corridor where the invisible seemed to have taken tangible form. Something was happening, something I could neither see nor understand. And this was just the beginning. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. A girl, barely 20 years old, passed by that very spot. Suddenly, she let out a high-pitched scream that echoed off the subway walls. She stood on the spot, her eyes full of terror, while her friend tried to calm her down. After a few moments, I heard her whisper something to her friend. Her words hung in the air, hovering like a warning. There's something here," whispered to me. I looked around me, searching for an explanation, but nothing had changed. People were still passing by, the lights were still flickering, and the air still smelled old and dusty, except for that one spot in the hallway, that one spot that tripped people up, that whispered in my ears and seemed to be changing my routine life. A few minutes later, another passerby, a businessman with a briefcase, also claimed to have heard something as he passed that spot. Again and again, people reported the same experience, inaudible whispers, voices that seemed to come out of nowhere. I even witnessed a lady being pushed and shoved. When subway users approached to help her and asked if she was okay, she mentioned that something had pushed her hard. I found no answer. I could not explain what had happened. All that remained was the shadow of the unexplainable, the echo of whispers, and the image of people stumbling over the invisible. And so my day ended in the midst of mystery and unease, leaving me with the enigma of what was really in that subway corridor. Thank you very much for reading my story. I hope you enjoyed it.
The last one on the platform
Good morning, Herr. My name is Uriel. I work as a policeman in the subway. I have listened to the anecdotes of other policemen in the channel, and I would like to tell my experience. It's not long by any means, but I hope you like it anyway. That night, the station was particularly quiet. The rumor of the city barely filtered through, only the distant echo of trains disappearing into the gloom. The last artificial light illuminated the empty platform, a lonely scene that marked the end of my shift. At the end of the platform, a solitary figure broke the monotony of concrete and steel. A man, on the ground leaning against the wall, the reflection of the light on his clothing revealed an appearance that did not fit in this environment. A neat suit, a neatly knotted tie. Not the kind of attire you expect to see on someone who's decided to use the subway as a sleeping shelter. I approached slowly. My footsteps echoing in the vastness of the place. When I finally reached his side, I noticed that something wasn't right. He didn't move, not even a slight change in his breathing. His eyes were open, fixed on some point in the distance, but empty of life. I moved his shoulder, but his body remained inert, like a statue of flesh and bone. Reality hit like a train head-on. He was dead. I had never faced a death on my watch. Well, I had never faced any death. I'd seen everything from fights and robberies to missing people. But a dead man, in the middle of his routine, that was something new. And I couldn't help but think about him, about his story, about how he had come to this final point in his life. Who was he, I wondered? What kind of life did he lead? The suit suggested a decent job, a businessman perhaps. But why was he here, deep in the night, alone on the subway platform? My mind was filled with questions. But beyond it all, I was overcome by a sense of immense loneliness, a mirror of their tragic end. And I couldn't help but think of my own existence, of the forgotten faces I saw every day. How many of them, I wondered, were moving toward an end as lonely as this? How many were trapped in their routine, oblivious to the life they were supposed to live? When the daylight returned and the body was removed, we were in the security room, a room with a wall of screens showing every corner of the subway. This is where the memory of the subway is stored, where every face, every story is silently recorded. Faces passed in flurries, people moving in a hurry, a constant dance of humanity. It was here that we saw his story, the story of the man who died alone on the platform. Watching his last day was like peering into a world I had never noticed, one that was always in front of me but which I completely ignored. He appeared on the screen, a man in a suit in the middle of the morning crowd. He moved with some haste, pacing back and forth across the platform, his face marked by anguish. Every movement, every gesture suggested a discomfort that went beyond the physical. At that moment, he became more than just a figure on the screen. He began to take shape in my mind, like a character in a story that was unfolding in front of me. What was distressing him so much? Was it the stress of work, the pressure of modern life? He kept moving. His eyes looked around, but didn't seem to see anything. Feeling so bad, he walked to the wall at the end of the platform and sat down. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His face twisted in pain, his hands clutched at his chest, and little by little, his body collapsed. The crowd around continued its steady dance, oblivious to the fallen figure, each one wrapped in their own world, their own drama, ignoring the tragedy unfolding beside them. It was as if life itself continued its unchanged march, oblivious to the death that had just occurred. It was a chilling scene, not because of his death, but because of the indifference with which it was received. The loneliness of his end, amplified by the crowd around him, was a stark reminder of our insignificance in this vast world. As a result, I began to see my life from a new perspective. The loneliness of the man in the suit made me question my existence. Was I also walking through life aimlessly, not enjoying the moments life had to offer? I found myself thinking about the little things I used to enjoy, the moments of peace in the midst of chaos, the little joys I found in the routine of everyday life. I promised myself that I would try to find those moments again, to enjoy life more before it's too late. The death of the man in the suit, tragic as it was, had taught me something. It had awakened in me a desire to live more fully, to appreciate the small moments we often take for granted. I don't know if I will be able to change. The noise of the subway, the forgotten faces, the stories that fade in the darkness of the tunnels, everything remains the same. But now, there is an awareness, a lament that echoes in my mind. The lament of the everyday, the desire to live beyond the routine, to find joy in the small moments. I hope this story is helpful to someone in your audience, Herr. I know it's not scary in the classic sense of the word, but I think you understand where the fear in this anecdote comes from.